Order, order. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We are delighted to be joined this morning with the Minister for Food Security and Rural Affairs. Daniel, you're very welcome. First of what I hope will be many sessions with the committee. Just for the benefit of our official record and for those watching our proceedings, can I invite you and your colleagues to introduce yourselves, please?
Yes, well, thank you, and thank you for inviting us this morning. I'm Daniel Zeichner. I'm the Minister for Food Security and Rural Affairs. And my colleagues...
I'm Emily Miles, Director General for Food, Biosecurity and Trade at DEFRA.
And I'm Janet Hughes. I'm Director of the Farming and Countryside Programme in DEFRA.
Okay, good morning. You're all very welcome, and thank you as ever for joining us. Daniel, the Prime Minister tells us that food security is national security. In practical terms, for Britain's farmers, what does that mean?
What that means is that we absolutely stand with farmers because they are crucial to feeding the nation. And I appreciate it's been a difficult few years, to put it mildly, for farmers, whether it be weather, whether it be disease threat, and whether it be changes to agricultural support systems. But we cannot have a successful food system without those primary producers, which is why, through a series of measures which I'm sure we'll go on to discuss, we're determined to recognise the hugely important role that farmers play in our economy and also in our culture.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the Secretary of State said that the primary purposes of farming has and always will be to produce the food that feeds the nation. Too many policymakers in Whitehall have lost sight of that fact. This government is putting food production firmly back on the agenda. So what are the metrics here? How will we know when we've achieved food security?
Well, I think it's perhaps useful is actually sitting in these committee rooms takes me back to the passage of the Agricultural Act. And there was a period of time a few years ago, I think, when there was a sense that somehow food production wasn't the primary purpose of agriculture. And that is why both the Secretary of State and I have been very determined to make this point, that although we are undertaking an important transition to more nature-friendly, environmentally friendly farming practices, the primary purpose of production must be food. Now, in terms of the metrics, of course, and again, it's important, I think, always to go back to the legislative basis upon which we work, because that's the framework in which ministers operate. The Agriculture Act, of course, set out the obligation to do a food security report. Debate at the time, subsequently arguments with the House of Lords as to how frequent that should be. But I was very pleased that the first food security report fell within the first few months of my place in post. So the food security report was issued back before Christmas, in good time, this time I would hasten to add. And I think that gives a very, very full account of the various metrics that we would look at, because it's a complicated set of issues, often understood, perhaps understandably, by the public as household security, and that's very, very important. But I would also say it's very important, as Secretary of State has said, to recognise it's a part of our national security, particularly in a world that is quite challenging. So that report, I think, was not complacent, but reassuring that many of the issues that I'm sure we'll go on to discuss are being addressed seriously.
So where are we on the road to food security?
Well, I would refer you back to the report, which says that essentially we are okay, but we should not be complacent, not least, as I say, because of the geopolitical issues, which are things which we have less control over. But on each of the measures, at the moment, we're doing well enough.
Well enough. Can we have a look at some of the decisions that the Department has recently taken with regard to, for example, the ending of the SFI? How do you think that decision in particular helps the move towards food security?
Well, the agricultural transition has been a complicated process. Obviously, again, came out of the Agriculture Act and represented a move away from the Common Agricultural Policy to a different form of support. And obviously these were policies that were introduced by the previous government, but in opposition I was broadly supportive of many of those measures, although there's always room for criticism. And one of the things we said when we came into government was we didn't want to just overturn what had been done. We wanted to follow through on it. And that is what we've done. One of the problems the previous government faced was that it seemed to have trouble getting money actually out the door and spent. There was actually an underspend. And there was, for a long period of time, it was quite hard to persuade farmers to take these schemes up. When I came into post, I was quite surprised to find actually there'd been quite a change with the most recent version of the scheme, whereby it was clearly much more attractive. And the problem would become
hindsight,
a different
was
one.
it a mistake not to interfere with the... With hindsight, was it a mistake?
No, I don't think so, because the sector was very clear. What they wanted was continuity. Mm-hmm. So what we've achieved over that period of time is we've actually spent the budget, essentially, which is very different from what happened before.
You complained that you'd inherited an uncapped budget, and you said that was the problem that led to the closure of the SFI in the way that it did.
Well, I think we all knew from the and this is why sometimes people have looked a bit surprised when I was asked when I knew, and the answer was in these committee rooms 5 years ago, because we were moving from the Common Agricultural Policy approach, which basically said that everyone who had the entitlement would get a payment, to a different approach where people would be applying for schemes. And, of course, there is a limit to the amount of money you have to spend.
So is this the future for farmers? The closing of the SFI, are we going to see more schemes operate like this in the future?
Absolutely, and of course the government, through the spending review, we got a good settlement in my view, the biggest one we've got, over £5 billion over 2 years. But of course what we're paying for now are environmental benefits, public money for public goods, as agreed in the previous legislation.
We can come on to that, but the RPE website promised people 6 weeks' notice. Why did they not get that?
Now I understand. I think I might actually pass over to one of my colleagues here who's more engaged in the detail of how the scheme is administered.
So why did we not get the 6 weeks' notice that was promised on the RPE website?
There was a choice to be made about how to ensure the maximum number of applicants could get fair access to the scheme, and the choice that ministers took was to continue allowing people to apply naturally and close it when the funding had been exhausted. It has been closed to new applicants for now, but ministers have been quite clear that we're now working to develop what the next iteration of the offer will look like, and there will be details of that to come in July. Yeah.
So, I mean, what farmers were told just wasn't true then? Yeah, Jean? Yeah.
Because I think on the actual system there was something that said that there was there would be a six weeks notice before it closed. Was that a mistake on the system, on the form on the system then?
I think it's probably not helpful for us to comment on the specifics of individual cases and concerns about exactly what people are expecting.
If you don't comment on these things, how can we understand what's been done?
My best explanation for the committee is that the decision was made to close the scheme at the point when the funding had expired. That was not without precedent. That had been done at least twice before during the time that I've been in my role. And that decision was made in order to allow the largest number of people to apply within the budget. There are people who had applications in flight, and we're aware of that. And as I've said, the next iteration of the scheme, the details will be available in the summer for those farmers to be able to apply.
Can I give you a couple of examples of lived experience here? This is taken from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, so it's all information that's in the public domain. Amelia Greenway from Springwater Farm in Devon says, "We missed out on submitting our SFI claim by 40 hours. We were just about to submit our application after several months of preparation. We have definitely missed out on £80,000 of funding. It could be as high as £94,000. She then goes on to explain the things they wanted to do. We were going to go for the low-input harvest cereal crop option, which we would have used to start producing our own organic pig food. She then lists the other things that would be entirely and completely to be encouraged within the SFI scheme. So what is Amelia Greenway and her farming business going to do to make up that £80,000, possibly £94,000 shortfall? So Daniel, can you answer that? I think it's more appropriate.
I totally understand people's frustration with this, and believe you me, I share the frustration too, because basically we inherited a scheme that did not have a mechanism for resolving and prioritising.
Yeah,
So,
and as you would have said in opposition, if only we were in government, we could do something about this. Well, now you're in government.
absolutely, and that is why we will use this period before opening up the new scheme to tackle this kind of issue. The question I find myself asking is how could that scheme have been introduced in that kind of way in the first place? But that is what we had. Now, the choice we had at any point was whenever we said it's nearly full, you get a huge rush, and you have exactly the same problem again.
You have that spike anyway, because rumours were circulating, weren't they?
Indeed, rumours were beginning to circulate, and of course because of that we then had to act, which is the
So
responsible
the
thing
people
to do.
who were able to get in under the wire were the people who were on the inside track, the people who had the land agents, the advisors, the consultants.
To some extent you're right, but of course this is the nature. This is why I go back to the beginning, the starting point on this. We've moved from a scheme where 80,000 farm enterprises were all entitled through the basic payment scheme to get resource, to a different approach. This was the consequence of the Agriculture Act and the move to a system. Theoretically, very few people could get a share of the money, providing they were providing the environmental benefits. And from the taxpayer's point of view...
Let's take another example from the same source. Anna Beastie, Deepdale Farm, Norfolk. We're in the final year of a 5-year countryside stewardship mid-tier agreement. This was absolutely vital for us, as we have put land which had been intensively farmed and had degraded soil into stewardship. It ensured the farm was financially viable while we rested our land and repaired our soil. Good things for any farmer to be wanting to do. We had been preparing to apply for SFI at the end of our current mid-tier agreement. Now that's not going to be available to us. I'm looking at a £140,000 gap in our budget for next year, which terrifies me.
Totally sympathise and understand with the situation people found themselves in, but what I would say is that when you look at the complexity of these different schemes and the interrelationship between them, we need to design a better system so that people can understand how it works, what are the risks, and we need to decide how we allocate most effectively, because as this will probably be a refrain, we're responsible for public money. Yeah. And we need to find the best environmental outcomes that we can buy for that public money.
And were these people that I've quoted you not providing good public outcomes?
I can't comment on individual cases, but what I can say is that almost inevitably there will be some schemes that provide better environmental outcomes than others. And what we've inherited, I'm afraid, is a package of schemes which do some very good things. And I should say at this point that actually, when you look at the number of farms that are now in schemes, it actually is quite an achievement. I think you probably had the figures, Janet. I'm just looking to find them. Yeah, over 70,000 live agro-environment scheme agreements now, over 37,000 live SFI agreements, more than 50,000 farm businesses, more than half of all farm land being managed under environmental land management schemes. So while I absolutely understand, Chair, why you cite those examples, I would also say there are a huge number of examples where the system is working very well.
Do you still see the closure of the SFI as a government success story?
Of course it's not, because it wasn't done in the way that we would have liked to have done it. But
when are we going to see the next iteration of SFI then?
Sorry,
when will we see the next round of SFI?
Well, once we've had the spending review, we know the resources are available, then we'll know how much we have available to us. So we're talking about late summer
of next year.
The Secretary of State and I have both made it clear we want to see a scheme in place late summer. But
in the meantime, these farmers are sustaining these massive holes in their budget.
I understand that, but in the meantime, remember, there are tens of thousands of farmers who are benefiting from these schemes, and we're getting the environmental benefits that they are purchasing. So this is a huge change. I do not underestimate how difficult change is. This is a very, very big transition from one system to another. But I do think it is fair to point out that this was known that this change was being undertaken. Mm-hmm. And for those who were advising people, they perhaps should have been more aware of that system change, because they really should have been.
You see, the problem is it's all very well sitting here discussing this in the House of Commons, but your words will be heard in lambing sheds up and down the country when people are maybe sleep deprived, or maybe they're just because they're working with sheep and that doesn't put you in the best humour at the best of times, they will be absolutely incensed at what they're hearing from you. Will you apologise to those people that we've outlined, those who missed out because of the closure of the SFI?
I'm very sorry that people missed out, but it's in the nature of a scheme that you bid for. There's no guarantee that you get it, and that needs to be understood for the future. As I say, the old scheme, that was what it was. And just remember, not every farmer got basic payments. That was a scheme that was, remember that people under 5 hectares couldn't apply. They now can. So there'll be many people who have benefited from this, but unfortunately there are always people who suffer as well.
We will come later on to the people who were looking to SFI to make up the hole from the accelerated closure of BPS. Jane, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just very quickly. Janet, you mentioned July when you were talking about the SFIs, just to kind of try and get a bit more detail about the potential timeline for the new system. Do you think July 25 might be a realistic prospect for it reopening?
To clarify what I said the further information would come in July. As to when we're able to open a new offer and what that might look like, that depends on decisions to be made between now and then, which ministers have said they want to do in consultation with the sector, and we've already started doing that, and also on the settlement that we get in the SR, which we're due to have by then, and that's when we'll be able to confirm the timing as to what comes next.
We're hoping for an announcement in July.
Yes.
Thank you.
Really?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to tackle two aspects. One is the 6 weeks closure, and one is the scale of the fund. Now, I appreciate that I've had constituents and farmers reach out to me on the evening when the fund was closed and had real concerns of having to work through it. But I think it'd be good to hear, Minister, if we can, there was never previously a 6-week deadline on the previous fund. The previous government gave a 2-week notice. So that 6-week comment that sits on the application is misleading in itself, that the application never previously had a 6-week closure deadline. Is that the case?
Well, it is the case that the previous schemes have been closed as well.
Yeah.
So
when they reached the point of fallout, effectively.
Well, they were closed for different reasons. So to some extent, the thing that was different about this situation was the scheme was oversubscribed. It was reaching the limit, and that is something we will need to look at in future as to how we can make sure that people are better informed. But the basic point is many people had applied much earlier. I fully appreciate there are people who are in a situation where they might have expected the scheme to run on for longer. Yeah. But frankly, I think, as the chair has suggested, there was a sense, I think, amongst a lot of people that this was likely to happen at some point, which it inevitably would, because it's a cash-limited budget.
Which brings me on to my second question, which I suspect might be more of a point than a question, but I would appreciate your comments on it. It goes back, and I appreciate there's a lot of emotion and frustration that people rightly have in trying to access the funds that closed when they were trying to access it, and I've had those conversations first hand, and I passed them on to the department. The government has paid out over £1 billion through the SFI fund, which compares, I believe, to 300 million from the previous fund. But the real issue in all of this was the design of the original fund. There was a first-come, first-served basis that gave no accounting for need, and it was an SFI fund that was totally unfit for purpose. And that I'd appreciate that if there's a chance for us to feed in how that SFI fund could be better served for the future. So not only do we not find ourselves in a situation to end with, nor rather to start with, but that it does direct the funding, direct the source of those that need, not those with consultants that can give them the best access to an application, not those that have that have a far more profitable farm in the first place. I know that in the conversations that I have with my constituents, the ones that need the funds the most don't have access to consultants to give them the best chance of getting an application forward. And it's the SFI fund is something to be celebrated, but we need to make sure that £1 billion fund, or whatever it is in the next round of funding, is directed at those that most need it and continue to be a success story for those to access it, support environmental funding in place.
There's quite a lot in there, so I'll try and... No. Points were well made. Some of it, I mean, the underspend of the previous government wasn't just SFI, so it was a range of things. Yeah. I wouldn't agree with you that the SFI schemes were, I can't remember quite the word to use, unfit for purpose. I think we should actually be pleased that so much land is now being managed in a different way, because under the Common Agricultural Policy there was very limited purchase that we got as a society for the money that was being paid out. So I would defend the transition, but could it be done much better? Absolutely. And that's the thing we now need to move to a discussion as to how we prioritise, because with what will inevitably, whatever the amount of money that we have available, there is a question then as to how you prioritise. And that is a genuine debate which I very much will welcome the committee's input on, because it could be on the basis of social need, but actually the legislation is far more specific about it being for some specific purposes around environmental measures. So this is, again, we are bound by the legislation, and that takes us back to the debate around the Agriculture Act. But the good news is there's so much more land now being farmed in more positive, environmentally sensitive ways, and that should be celebrated alongside the importance of making sure that we secure food production, which goes back to my opening point, which is that must remain the primary purpose for agriculture.
Just before we move on, does it concern you that repeated surveys of the farming industry show a massive loss of confidence to invest in the future, and the impact that that will then have on getting to that point of food security?
Of course it concerns me, and I would very much hope that over a period of time, as we have these discussions with the sector, that the plans we're putting in place, particularly the farming roadmap, and we'll come on to some of the other points, the things that we're putting in place, will build confidence. But I don't underestimate how difficult a period of change is. And the change, of course, was partly a change of government, also a change in the whole support system, but also wider changes that are going on in the world. So I'm not surprised that people are anxious, and part of my job is to build trust, and I hope that by being clear about our plans for the future we can do that.
How confident are you that these surveys in 12 months' time will be showing greater confidence?
Well, I've watched the confidence surveys over a number of years, and the truth is there hasn't been much confidence for quite a long time, sadly. The challenge for us as a government is, as I say, to respond calmly and say, I hope rationally, to the experiences we've had, and I think on that basis, over time, we can rebuild confidence.
I mean, even so, the Family Business UK survey, which is a CBI economic survey, identified 55% of family-owned businesses, just below 49% of family farms have paused or cancelled planned investments since the budget. And these are stark figures, aren't they?
I hear the figures. What I would say is that the whole country is going through a difficult transition. We've moved from a position which was unsustainable economically. There are obviously wider budgetary issues, some of which I suspect we'll go on to. We are part of that change, and the agricultural sector is no different. But I genuinely believe that by taking the right decisions now, over the medium to long term, we will secure the future of the industry and the sector.
Before we move on, Sarah, you want to come in?
Oh yes, just very quickly. Thank you, Chair. I do struggle a little bit with the SFI, with that the fact that there was that 6-week window that everyone thought. And I think although you say that people should have known, obviously a lot of people say that they were absolutely shocked and stunned. And what I don't understand is that you would have had a budget in any other business. You see the budget getting close and you start to take action sooner. I appreciate you talked about spikes, but I think there's definitely more needs to be done on that in the future. But Janet, what I just wanted to ask, because I understand you've done an awful lot of work to try and build up the relationship between DEFRA and farmers, and obviously all this work around SFI. I just want to know, how do you feel now, because there is this lack of confidence?
I feel that there is a massive opportunity to make a difference for food production and farm profitability and the environment, and that opportunity hasn't changed. The environment we operate... I'm sorry?
A good difference, just to be clear. Because you're making a difference at the moment.
Yes, and that is what we all have been aspiring to do for a number of years and will continue to do. And I work for the government of the day and I implement their policies, so it's not for me to have feelings one way or another. My feeling is I'm fully committed to deliver what it is the government wants to do, and we will make that work as best that we can, as we always do.
Thank you, Sarah. Tim?
Yeah, because before we move on, what I think we will do, just sticking to this, I mean, in January we obviously had conversations about the the capital grant scheme, which had similar circumstances in November to what happened to SFI, and that lessons would be learned. I think the committee wants to, understand from you that we can be confident the lessons will be learned now from 2 instances where things were shut down very quickly. I have to say it was good, though, to see in February that money was found for those 4 applications that were pending from November, so that's positive. So some reassurance on learning the lessons from 2 instances now where we've shut down schemes. Can I ask about the impact? How many applications around SFI were pending but not completed? Do we have those figures?
Again, I think I might pass that one to Janet.
Yes, so we had, just to recap on the numbers for SFI, we have 32,000 businesses in SFI, more than 39,000 agreements, and at the time that we closed to new applications, there were about 4,000 applications that had been submitted and were to be processed, and RPA colleagues are working through those at a rate of about 500 a week. It goes up and down each week depending on the cases, so we're expecting to offer agreements to all of those applications. There were then around 3,000 that had been started but not completed within the last couple of months, and then there were more beyond that, but we don't typically see applications go to completion if they were started that long ago. They tend to be more people who were having a look, having a think about it, weren't intending to actually apply.
That's really helpful in sort of getting a sense of the impact of the closure of the scheme. The chair has mentioned issues around farmer confidence in the NFU surveys, obviously cash flow and other matters. Has the government given any consideration to an interim scheme? I know there have been organisations pushing for some sort of interim arrangements.
We consider everything, but obviously we're working within a budgetary envelope, and we have essentially spent the money that we have available. So obviously in an ideal world, there are all kinds of things one would do, but we're operating within a constrained environment. And I would say that there are a number of other schemes that are still available to people. But I'd also make a wider point here, Chair, that the Secretary of State has made it very clear that he thinks the future of the sector will depend upon the sector being able to run in a business-like way. So although there's clearly a strong case for environmental support coming through the taxpayer, that is what it is for. It is for environmental goods. So in the end, the onus is for businesses to run businesses. And we can really help with this because we can give a guaranteed income stream through these schemes and support systems. But of course, don't forget that the key income for many, many people will be the goods that they produce. And I would also point you to the Farm Business Survey, Income Survey, which shows that for most sectors, and this was published a few weeks ago, actually prices have been quite good. So there's a broader picture here.
Well, we can come back to prices being good because there are sometimes bad reasons for good prices. But I have to say, Secretary of State, that your assertion that farmers have to run in a business-like way brings with it an inference that that's not what they're doing at the moment. You do understand that would be deeply insulting?
That's not the inference, it's a statement of fact that all businesses, there are risks. And the question is the extent to which the state steps in. Now, obviously with the common agricultural policy...
It's not the state stepping in, it's the state stepping out in the way they did with SFI.
Well, record amounts of money going in. The question is who gets it. So it's a distributional question. And let me be clear, I absolutely understand how difficult this is for people. But it is a change, and part of the... perhaps we'll get on to the wider question of the changes that we've seen since our exit from the European Union. But there was a real demand for a changed system away from that very wide support system to a much more focused one on environmental goods. And these are perhaps some of the pains you get through that transition. And I absolutely understand how painful it is and difficult.
It's only a matter of time before somebody says we can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, so I'm going to move on. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to drill down into some of the figures that Janet that you've mentioned and gave Tim. And there's 3,000 applications that are in train. What is, and you mentioned another figure, I don't think you actually mentioned a figure, but you said others. Mm-hmm. What are the next steps for those applications?
The ones that had been submitted The RPA, Rural Payments Agency colleagues are working through those with the customers and are offering agreements at a rate of around 500 a week. So those who have submitted their applications will receive an agreement, assuming they're eligible. And those that had not submitted applications at that time, if they are participants in the SFI pilot, then they will still be able to apply. There's then a small number of those who were unable to apply because of a technical issue. They will still be able to submit their application. As to others that had intended to apply, they would need to wait for the next iteration of the offer to reopen if that's what they wanted to be able to do.
So then you're talking about a review being available in July, but no confirmation yet at what time that scheme might...
As I said, we won't be able to confirm the timing and exact details of that scheme until we've had a spending review settlement, but we expect to be able to share more information in July, and we are commencing engagement with the sector about what that should look like.
Okay. Daniel mentioned earlier that we're doing well enough in food security terms, but a farmer in my constituency from Long Sutton told me that after the closure of the SFI, he's contemplating leaving his ground fallow due to the risk of a failed crop and obviously not being able to reach funding. And it's going to push his farm further into debt, and I think some of the start figures that Chair has mentioned. Danny, do you understand that this abrupt and unexpected policy decisions is going to put food security at risk?
I don't agree it puts food security at risk. What I do agree is that for individuals it can be really, really hard, and I'm totally sympathetic to that. But I do think it's important to stand back and look at the system as a whole, which is what the Food Security Report looks at. And that's why I conclude, I can't quite remember the terminology from the Food Security Report now, but basically we are producing what we need, but of course we import quite a lot as well, and that's why the global political situation is important. We should never be complacent about food security. I think it's come up the political agenda because people are rightly concerned, and there is now a big discussion to go on. We may come on to this around how we use our land effectively, but of course you will know that even the fields that we see being grown, some of it doesn't go to food production directly, some of it goes to energy production and so on, and some of it goes, quite a lot of it of course goes to animal feed. So it's a complicated picture. So I think just to say that one particular unit of production that comes out of production, of course for the farmer concerned is highly significant, but for the overall system I think one needs to see what's happening overall. I
think when you're talking about thousands of farmers, though, that multiplier effect, it becomes quite dramatic, doesn't it? In that at the end of the day we're talking about businesses, farm businesses being viable and profitable, but obviously if farmers are leaving their land fallow, they are going to put their farm business at risk. We've already said around the room today that confidence in farming is at an all-time low. These decisions recently have created uncertainty and financial difficulties for farmers, limiting their opportunity to invest. Just looking at the ELMs, it's made up of 4 pillars, obviously SFI being one of those, a central pillar to that. I was just interested to know if there's any ability to move funding across those pillars in a better way, because there is some limited data that's coming out around ELMs, but I haven't been able to see enough, and so I'm just interested to see if funding is available to be able to be ported over to the other pillars.
It's never been fixed within, as my understanding from the previous government's approach. There were and it goes again right back to the passage of the Agriculture Act when it was discussed in some detail in these committee rooms between the Tier 1 level agreements, which are effectively the SFI, the nature recovery element and the landscape recovery element. So all 3 parts we are taking forward. But again, there's a complexity here because, of course, some of these agreements run for a number of years. They finish at different points, which is why it is quite hard at any one point in time to make a fixed observation about it. We have to calculate and look ahead because we're in contractual agreements with farmers, obviously, which we will keep. So some of our spending choices for 2-3 years ahead are essentially already made because of the nature of the existing agreements that have been inherited. But in answer to your question, there is flexibility because it's not fixed. What we did do was put as much money into SFI as we could because we wanted to get as much money out to farmers as possible.
Is there any underspend in any of the other three pillars?
Well, underspending in that sense is a
Projected underspend.
is a slightly movable feast because we've used as much. The overall amount is what we're dealing with, the 5 billion for the 2 years. And as I say, we pushed as much money out to SFI. We could have shut the scheme much earlier, but we chose not to because we were actually pleased that people are taking the scheme up, given the problem in the past being the fact that people were reluctant. And this is one of those difficulties when you've got these kind of schemes. An area-based payment is very simple by comparison.
Okay, so no opportunity to port money funding across from other pillars.
Perhaps
Can I add a
Emily,
little bit?
you could help.
So just to explain the way the budget works, it's a allocated budget from the Treasury, which is allocated to farming. Within that, we then have to allocate it to the basic payment scheme, SFI, countryside stewardship, etc., landscape recovery. The main things that we struggle to move things between are capital and resource. So they're more fixed, but within the resource budget, we could choose to move, say, and as happened last year, you could move things from the basic payment scheme into the other schemes. That's a choice for DEFRA. However, from a budgetary management point of view, we have to then set a budget for the individual schemes to live within. Otherwise, we're struggling in the course of the year, partly because of what Daniel described, because of the multi-year commitments that we're making. So we the SFI agreements, for instance, tend to be for 3 years. So the choice that we just made to pause it was because we could see the commitments that had been made for this financial year, 25-26 and 26-27, in the context of the budgets that we'd chosen. So there are choices for ministers to make about how they allocate that overall farming budget to individual schemes, although once we settle them at the start of the business planning year, we tend to stick to them unless there's a very unexpected event, so that we can manage the money as best we can.
If I may just add, just to answer your question specifically about underspends, there aren't any underspends projected in other areas that you could move. In order to be able to add more money into SFI, you would have to reduce planned spend in other areas that we are expecting to be able to deliver.
Can you confirm that there will be funding available in future years for SFI funding?
Well, that would depend on the spending review. So this is why, to some extent, we are constrained about what we can say about the future, and we'll know more about that in July.
It's worth saying, though, that ministers have made clear that those with existing agreements will continue to be paid within those agreements across all of the schemes. But that's not in debate.
To keep on Sarah's point, but the intention of the government in the spending review, or certainly your hope in DEFRA, is to continue with SFI in the future.
Hope, absolutely,
absolutely.
I'm afraid that's not a decision that I take, but we are making a very strong case, and of course, partly we need to be able to demonstrate good value for the schemes that we are running, and that will help us make a strong argument.
And not least that it is one of the central pillars of the ELMS programme, and obviously it needs to be delivered. I'm just looking at your thoughts around the assessment that you've made on the sudden closure of the SFI and the impact that it will have on environmental practices, potentially forcing some of those farmers that have missed out on this funding to accept that they will not be able to deliver some of their ambitions around environmental farming practices. What's your assessment of the impact that will have?
Well, we are reviewing the environmental improvement plan, which this all feeds into, and we're very mindful of our national of our targets and goals for 2030. So we want to do everything we can to meet that. But I say we are limited by the amount of money that we have got, and we will look at other measures to try and help us if we don't have the resources necessary. But that is part of the wider argument, wider debate, if you like, about how we go forward as a country. It's about setting the priorities. This is a huge change, something which I think it's fair to say probably no one else has really tried to do, to develop, and when I meet my international counterparts, they're genuinely interested in what we're doing here, because this is really something quite different from what others have tried to do. So we're still in the relatively early stages yet, But of course, I would love to have more money to spend on these schemes, but I have to work within the budget.
Do you think that that volatility that's being created at the moment is giving farmers confidence in their future business?
Well, I think what is good about this is an alternative income stream for farmers, which they can rely on into the future, but we've got to demonstrate its good value for money to maintain that support from the Treasury. But I think Janet was going to add something.
If I may, Chairman, just on the environmental impacts, it might be worth for the committee to understand what is currently being paid for through SFI and what will be paid for over the coming years in relation to those impacts, which we expect to continue, and it will continue to be paid for, which is around 4 million hectares of land in the scheme, 800,000 hectares of arable land being farmed without insecticides, 423,000 hectares of grassland being managed with low inputs, 110,000 kilometres of hedgerows under sensitive management, which is enough to go around the world more than once, certainly. And the evaluation that we've done of SFI most recently shows that of those responding, out of 5,000 that we asked, we got a good response rate. In our most recent survey, 31%. And we saw an overall positive rating of those coming into the scheme of 71%. And it's been 70 to 80% for the last couple of years, and that's gone up very significantly since our pilot. And we can see evidence of additionality, farmers taking action beyond what they were already doing. We can see evidence of positive impacts on farm businesses and their incomes and their resilience. And we can see positive impacts of some of the changes we've made for tenants, etc. So I think it would be fair to say that there's quite strong evidence. Happy to write to the committee with more about the positive impact made to date. And as the Minister has said, what we want to do now is work out how we target the funding that's available going forward so we can make further positive impacts on those outcomes. And as to the Environment Act targets, there is a review of the EIP underway, as you'll be aware, and what happens in respect of those longer term targets depends very much on the decisions made about what comes next across all of those schemes to build on that progress to date.
All the more galling for those who wanted to get in and had the door slammed in their face.
General, when you were Shadow DEFRA Secretary, in relation to SFI funding, you said farmers have no guarantee that the goalposts won't be moved again and support undermined. The recent chaos and confusion around environmental land management schemes has spooked farmers and environmentalists alike and done nothing to help British farmers. To what extent do you think the recent decisions on SFI have had a similar effect?
What I think is different now is we are having an open dialogue about the future, because I can't quite remember exactly which period that was referred to, but there was a series of false starts, I would say, under the previous government. Where we are now is we are far...
2022.
2022, right, okay, so quite early on when it was really not working at all. We've now got a system where the money is going out, where exactly as Janice has just described, we can see a large amount of land being farmed differently as a consequence of these schemes. What we've got to do is learn from that and take it forward. But I say I don't underestimate how big a change this is for farmers. Also, big change for the department, because we're doing something very different from what was being done before, which essentially was taking money and just handing it to people. Now we are actually genuinely getting good public benefit, exactly as was agreed during the passage of the Agriculture Act. But this is pretty groundbreaking stuff, and what I want to do is build a long-term relationship with the sector so that we can get these benefits which are being paid for by the public, but also provide good support for farmers alongside the businesses they're running.
I'm really worried about the time frames here, because there's so many farmers that I've spoken to in my constituency, and I know other members will be the same, that don't know whether they're going to survive that long. A farmer in my constituency said that his farm will have to be sold and his son and daughter will not have the chance to continue producing food and supporting wildlife because they literally are on the brink right now. A lot of what you're saying is going to be too late for so many of those farmers. So when you say that the scheme, the SFI, is going to be morphing into a new one because of its success, what is it going to look like? Because it's been so successful, how are we going to ensure that we're going to capture all of those farmers that want to produce food, they want to ensure that their businesses are viable and successful? What is the new SFI scheme going to look like? And how are you going to target that scheme in terms of geographically, by action, by wealth, recipient? What flavour are you going to give
just
it?
get the headlines of that, because
That is exactly the discussion we want to have with the sector, with yourselves and with others, because all those options are potentially available. But what I think is absolutely important to remember is it will never be, probably as an unlimited budget, which we would all love to have. We will have to make choices. So it's the same as any other part of the decision-making process that has to be made. So different people will make a case for the different things to be prioritised. But I say we do have to be mindful of the legislative basis that we start from, which these are primarily environmental schemes. They're really, really important. And obviously, how you allocate it, I think it's a fair question to ask. Is it solely on the most environmental benefit? But if that turned out to be just in one part of the country, for instance, would that be reasonable? I don't think it would be. I think there are other things that need to come in terms of allocation. But that is the debate we want to have.
Can I bring you in?
Yeah, just quickly, because I think it builds on these points. And we had a good conversation in January with you, Emily, as well. But one quote stuck in a lot of the committee's minds at that time, I know, which was we had a discussion about viability. Of course, there's huge amounts of tension here, food security, productivity, the environment. But Emily, you said, I don't think we can expect every single farm will be viable. But if we're talking about 92 to 93% having the opportunity of productivity improvement, that is what we're aiming for. And I suppose that created a concern that we're talking about potentially 7 to 8% of farms not being viable. I wondered if you wanted to clarify.
I'm really glad you asked that, because my team had a couple of comments about my comments afterwards, and I'd like Janet to just explain it a little bit better. Thank you.
I'm very happy to elaborate on that, Chairman, which is that we carry out analysis to assess the opportunity for farms to be viable, taking into consideration the range of factors, including government policy, but also wider factors and the impacts that we expect to see from reducing direct payments as well as introducing payments through schemes. And our assessment is based on an assessment of the spread of viability and profitability of different farm types, different sectors, different parts of the country. And based on an assessment as to the opportunity for farms to make a modest productivity improvement, we would expect 92% to be able to be viable after all of these changes, taking into consideration the factors that we can see, with a modest improvement. For the remaining 8%, they would need to make a more significant improvement in order to remain viable after transition. So it's not that we would expect them not to, it's that we're recognising that for those particular cohort of farms that might be in areas where they have more restricted opportunity or business models where they haven't yet had the advantage of business advice, which is why some of that was funded through the resilience programme, they would need to make more significant productivity improvements. And that's based on a series of assessments as to the changes that we're seeing and the factors that are likely to drive that. But it's also important to say there's some uncertainty around that, firstly, because it depends on individual businesses making those decisions, and also external factors that we don't control and can't always predict and have been more volatile than usual in recent years. But also that the starting point was such that there was a large proportion of farms that were at that stage not profitable, and average incomes were low in the sector, and that's why the wider range of policies that the Minister's been talking about are also relevant here around farm profitability and productivity.
That's really, so that leads me on to naturally ask, were there sectors or areas in particular where there was a bigger challenge around productivity improvement?
Yes, so we tend to see, and this has been borne out in the numbers around farm business incomes to some degree since the start of the transition, where actually for most types of farm business income is higher now than it was 5 years ago, but for those grazing in less favoured areas, they're lower to about 5%, and cereals about 6%, and mixed farms about 7%, and they're volatile from year to year. Our assessment of risk is that those in less favoured areas, so upland, grazing, livestock farms, they tend to have had basic payments as a higher proportion of their income, and also have much more restricted opportunity for profitability and productivity than some of the more productive areas of land. Also mixed and lower lowland grazing livestock farms tend to see lower incomes and tend to be more vulnerable. And they, however, also conversely stand to gain the most from environmental land management schemes and do tend to make a higher income from those schemes because they're more incentivised to participate in them. So they do tend to participate in higher numbers and to a higher value in those schemes.
If they get in under the wire, if they're the ones that have got the support to get the applications in on time, Is that characteristic of upland farmers, do you think?
Well, it's worth saying that in our most recent survey, 70% of commercial farms are in schemes, and we do tend to see a high representation of farms being in schemes in the uplands. A lot of them will still be in HLS agreements, which is the legacy type agreements, or higher tier. There is high demand. We haven't talked very much about higher tier this morning, but there's quite a lot of demand for higher tier that's unmet in those sorts of areas, and that's where the bigger income opportunity actually often is for those types of farms, and we're restricted on our ability to take new farms into that scheme because they are bespoke agreements that require advice. And what we've been working on there with Natural England and other colleagues, Forestry Commission colleagues, is how can we looking at how to increase the volume of people coming into those agreements, because that's actually where it's going to make the biggest difference for upland farmers. In addition, we have had a moorland offer and grassland offers in SFI. We've seen good uptake, but it is looking at higher tier and landscape recovery as well that's going to really make the difference. And it's worth also noting that before making the announcement on SFI, ministers did also decide to increase prices in HLS and the budget for that for £30 million for those exact farmers where they haven't seen price increases. They are already in the schemes, that's not the problem for them, but they weren't seeing a reasonable reward, and they will take effect for this claim year, and we'll be announcing further details of that and writing to all those agreement holders in April to let them know.
This could maybe be a yes or a no. Are you seeing a disproportionate effect on upland farmers or not?
Of a disproportionate effect of
the inability to get into SFI?
I think it would be too early for us to be able to say with clarity, because we tend to see farm business incomes are volatile. We tend to look at 3-year averages. The impacts of lots of different factors will be at play at the moment. As we've said earlier, for whatever reason, actually prices are higher than normal for lamb and other sorts of livestock produce at the moment, and there are other economic factors at play, obviously. So we keep a close eye all the time on these factors. We're not seeing any of those impacts just now.
Yeah. I guess there would be a worry that the farmers then that you're suggesting are that need to make the greatest productivity improvements are also the farmers with some of the lowest incomes in the country, which is very concerning. So you mentioned the Farming Resilience Fund, which I think has been broadly welcomed by farmers as a positive place for advice. Can you build on what sort of stuff the department will be doing to support farmers with good quality advice as all these changes are going through? Affordable quality advice, I should say.
I can pick that up. So we've had historically a range of different ways to support, fund and enable farmers to access the advice that they need. And there's a range of different types of advice, including technical advice on meeting regulatory requirements, and the catchment sensitive farming programmes have been really effective and is quite well regarded in that respect. Also accessing schemes and doing those effectively, and Natural England, Forestry Commission and Environment Agency colleagues provide that, but also there's a growing sector of support for that. And also business advice, which is what was provided through the Resilience Fund. That was always intended as a transitional fund for the early years of the farming transition to help farmers to plan their way through, because each farm is different and they need to be able to make their own individual plans. We saw a really good uptake of that. What we're doing now for ministers is a piece of work to review the entire landscape of advice and what the needs are going into the next phase, so that as part of our work preparing for the spend review outcome and the next phase of delivery, we can decide what's the right package. And what we're looking at there is not just a model of us paying for or giving advice to farmers, but what's it actually really going to take for farmers to be profitable going forward. And some of that will be about, and resilient, some of that will be about access to advice, some of it will be about access to the schemes I'm responsible for, some of it will be more about the wider set of levers and policies that affect farm viability and resilience, which is what the profitability unit is going to be looking at.
Okay, Sarah, you go.
Thank you, Chair. I think from the message I'm getting there is obviously that planning is absolutely key, and we know that that is the case for farmers, but I feel at this current moment in time they'll all be shouting to say there was no consultation about the changes to APR and BPR before it came into effect. They've had national insurance hikes, there's a tax on fertilisers, there's a tax on double cab pickup trucks, you've closed the countryside stewardship, now you've just reopened it, you've now just removed SFI, and you've brought forward the removal of direct payments. So will you apologise for not giving our farmers any opportunity to plan?
What I will say is that £5 billion is the most we've spent. The most we've spent. I understand that there's unhappiness out there. There's unhappiness across the economy, because I'm afraid it's not just farmers who are unhappy. I'm afraid a lot of people suffered a lot over the last decade, and this is a process of change, and it's difficult and it's hard. Now, I understand that there's a whole range of things that you've cited there, but there are other things that we've been doing that are positive and supportive to the sector, and we'll continue to do those. So what I hope we can do is have a sensible conversation about how we allocate the resources, as we've been having this morning, recognising there's a complexity. We'll just go back to the point about farm viability as well, because my recollection from the Agriculture Act is there was a lot of supporting documentation then, but those figures haven't changed. So this has been a long-term issue about how many farms were likely to be viable and what would need to be done to get them to a place where they were secure in the long term. And that's what we really want to achieve here, to get farms into a position where they're not so dependent on day-to-day decisions from government that they are viable businesses, part of a wider food sector that we absolutely know is going to be essential for the future of our country. That's where we want to get to.
But I guess all of those changes I just listed completely takes away the optionality for that, doesn't it? That's when you've got this long term, because I know you've got this new deal for farmers that you're coming out with. So, for example, I think one of the limbs is you want to encourage diversifying income streams. And you also want to change the planning reforms so that it's quicker for farmers to build buildings and barns, but you'll appreciate that that will increase the value of their estate, in which case why would they do that at this stage if there's all these changes to APR and BPR? So you're giving with one hand and taking with the other. It's confusing.
Well, I think I would contest some of the points that you've already made, but what I would say is that in my 4 or 5 years now in the job shadowing it in the ministerial role, when I've visited farms, I've been often quite struck. I was expecting them to talk to me about the support system, and quite often actually the things they talked about were crime and also the planning system. So the planning changes are really, really potentially important for people, because that can unlock so many opportunities for people. I think we've probably broad agreement on that. So trying to find ways of making sure that farms have got a viable way forward, because the thing that, again, I'm sure we all agree on this, the unique thing about farming is it is a long-term business. It does rely on things which are outside people's control in terms of weather and sometimes input costs and so on. So it's important to have a mixture of income streams. So obviously the primary income stream is selling your product, but alongside that, the government support through environmental schemes and the opportunity to diversify. Now, of course, many have already done that, but there are many others who would like to. And we particularly think the energy opportunities, improving access to the grid, would again, really, really help many businesses. So we think there is a bright future for the sector. We just need to get ourselves to the point where people share that optimism view.
I'd love to share that optimism, but I guess my farmers have said to me that they have diversified and they've been penalised. So they're telling all their neighbouring neighbours, don't start, don't even try, because if you do, you're going to get hit. And I guess the fear as well is slightly when it comes to solar, for example. I'm actually having tenants who are being kicked out of the farms on the basis of the APR changes and the fact that solar's potentially coming. So I guess, what's the option for them there?
Again, it's a complicated set of issues there, but I would strongly defend the opportunity that's offered to many people through having solar farms, because it provides another income stream as well as tackling the energy issues that we know are really, really important to the country. So the tenancy issues are complicated, and we can talk about that as well, but we're introducing the Tenant Farming Commissioner. That point will be made, and very soon work closely with the tenant sector to make sure the farmland is tenanted. So it's a really important part of the mix, but also, of course, provide some of the flexibility that is so important to people.
I just wanted to ask on that, just final question, was just about that Tenant Farming Commissioner. So what's envisaged? Will they have a budget, or are they going to be like the Border Security Commander that's coming in, which is more of a title rather than actually effective? The
role is carefully described and outlined. I think we've seen the effect it's had in Scotland, which has been beneficial, and we expect it to have a positive impact. But the tenanted sector is complicated, and we've introduced the Code of Conduct to help people through some of these processes. I think it's worth remembering that it's actually a very effective system, works very well for lots of people, but where there are problems, we think this will be a valuable addition to help with that.
I said one final point. Okay. Just, it's a complete jump back, but it's just to the new deal for farmers. Maybe it's more of a plug, because I know you're very keen on introducing the breakfast clubs, but can I advocate that you use local farm produce and local produce in those breakfasts? Because that's what our farmers are calling for.
Well, it sounds like an excellent idea, and you will know that there's an aspiration to have far more produce that is bought by government, produced by our local farmers.
There we are, consensus at last. Tim, we've spoken quite extensively about communication. Do you mind if I move on?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Just before we do, though, Minister, it's reported this morning that we're going to see the first farming strike as wheat producers are going to refuse to supply milling quality wheat. This have an implication for the production of flour. How do you feel about being the food minister who took hot cross buns off the table at Easter?
Obviously, I understand the unhappiness that is out there, but equally, I'm very confident that we have resilient supply chains, and I would encourage people to engage in dialogue with us about the future, much as we have done this morning.
Do you think they haven't done?
That we haven't had dialogue. It's always possible to have better dialogue, but Secretary of State and I frequently out talking to farming organisations, and we have good dialogue with them. And whilst I understand the unhappiness,
these farmers are talking about taking a massive hit. Do you think they're just doing this on a whim or to make a political point?
as I say, Chair, I believe we have robust supply chains, and I encourage people to have a reasoned dialogue, very much as we had this morning, about the way forward for the future. But the overwhelming message should be this is a really, really important sector all the way through the food chain and does a magnificent job in feeding the country. We very much appreciate it.
Do you have any plans to meet those who are planning this strike?
I haven't had any communication so far.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on. Charlie.
Thank you, Chair. A good segue on to agricultural business property relief. There has been no consultation or affordability assessment done to this point, so would you commit to do that before the autumn budget?
Well, as you'll appreciate, this is a matter for the Treasury, and the Treasury Minister has been in constant dialogue over the last few months. There's a measure introduced in the budget, and we stand by it.
Constant dialogue is probably pushing it. I think we've had one
We've
meeting.
had a lot of debates, I think you'll find in this
There's
place.
been a lot of debates in this House, but not a lot of meetings between Treasury. There's been not a lot of meetings with Treasury ministers and representatives of the farming community. The biggest thing I'm hearing locally in East Yorkshire is the amount of money that is being pulled from the agricultural economy because farmers are having to save cash and are terrified of an impending inheritance tax bill. So has there been any assessment done of the wider impact on the rural economy of these changes to APR and BPR?
Well, the assessment the Treasury did is detailed in a letter that the Chancellor published to the Treasury Select Committee, and the figures, I have not seen any evidence suggest those figures have changed since then.
And what message have you got to those farmers who found themselves in particularly challenging circumstances in relation to elderly relatives who own the farm, who may be very ill and may not know how long they've got left, and the appalling stress that has put on these immediate changes without any consultation, without any forewarning? What message have you got to those people today?
Absolutely understand why people are stressed, and I have every sympathy with them. But what I would urge them to do is to look in detail. I did follow your discussions on this issue a few months ago here, and what struck me from the witnesses was just the complexity of the sets of arrangements that are actually in place in so many farming estates. And that is why this is a very complicated set of issues, and no two farms will be the same. And we stand by the projections that the majority of estates will not be affected. And I hope that that will be a reassurance to people. I would also say that the opportunity to gift during a lifetime and to open up opportunities for a younger generation, I think is actually a positive that comes out of this.
But that's completely at odds with the immediate change. And also you talk about the complexity. Surely complexity means we should take a more measured approach to introducing this.
I think what we've seen, and the Treasury figures showed this, that a very large amount of public money was going to a very few estates through this relief system. And it's not unreasonable for an incoming government to look at that. And so it's still a much more generous system that applies to the general population, and that recognises the particular circumstances of farming.
Is it right that a foreign-owned business who owns farmland doesn't have to pay this bill, but a family farm does?
I think there's a different set of questions in there. So, as I say, the Treasury made its announcements at the budget in a normal way, which is the way you would expect a budget to be presented, and obviously there's been considerable interest in it since. but I do not anticipate any changes.
Okay, just a slight change of tack. Have you had any discussions with government, with other arms of government, in relation to any US trade deal?
Well, government, of course, is looking very closely at what's happening internationally, and DEFRA quite rightly offers its advice on any issues that might come up.
So is agriculture potentially part of any trade deal? Have you had any discussions in relation to agriculture and food products?
Well, as any responsible government would do, we make preparations for all contingencies, but at the moment there is no trade deal.
Okay, so in that sense, you're not expecting agriculture to play any part in any trade deal with the US. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not directly involved in negotiations, I can't tell you, but what I can tell you is exactly as you'd expect, we provide advice, but we are absolutely determined to make sure, I can assure you, that our current position, which is that we will defend Britain's farmers, remains absolute.
If we're in a situation where you've got Treasury imposing devastating tax changes, you're not in discussions with other parts of government about a potential US trade deal, do you think that DEFRA and the Secretary of State is doing a good job of representing the countryside at the top table of government?
He's doing an excellent job, and I would only point to the amount of money that was secured in the spending review. Much speculation in advance that we would not get that level of support. We did, and it's all credit to the Secretary of State for exactly making the case for the food system in general and the rural economy, which is very precious to us.
I'll let the voters decide. Thank you, Jim.
They did.
Jane, did you want to come in on some of this?
It's been covered.
Okay. Well, we will take some questions then on livestock management and welfare. If we can maybe just keep it tight, Jenny.
Great. And I'll roll in another question to the second section. What steps has the department taken, moving on now, what steps has the department taken to safeguard the British livestock sectors following foot and mouth outbreaks recently that we've heard?
Very good. Obviously, we're very, very concerned to hear, first of all, the outbreak in Germany, and then the outbreak in Hungary and the recent outbreaks in Slovakia. So we have a very comprehensive, tried and tested system for responding to those kind of situations, very much guided by the advice of the chief vet. So those were put into place so that the restrictions on imports and so on. Certainly with the first case of Germany, I had a direct conversation with the German minister virtually on the first day it happened, or the following week in fact, and we got full cooperation from the German authorities, which we were very pleased with. I think you might remember I answered an urgent question in the House. A few weeks later, the Hungarian case, again, the same thing happened. Yeah. Pleased to say the German case seems now to have been resolved, but we do have these outbreaks in Slovakia, and the chief vet's advice, obviously we've followed completely, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that we do not have that threat, because it is a very, very real and anxiety-inducing, going back to the wider points about people feeling stressed. I absolutely understand why people are anxious about it, but what I can reassure you as a committee is that we are putting everything in place that is appropriate to put in place.
May I add a little bit, if that's okay? Is that okay, Chair?
Yes.
So after the German case, I also asked for some additional work to be done on our foot and mouth disease preparedness. So we've just, it's a relatively small project because we have a lot of energy and effort going at the moment into blue tongue and avian influenza, but we have put some people onto this. So they have been doing things like reviewing the compensation scheme, reviewing our control strategy, and then making sure that we continue with our surveillance, and obviously keeping a very close eye on what's happening in Hungary and Slovakia, mainly because we do have border controls. We are making sure that we're checking things as they come in. We changed our personal imports policy in the light of the event, but I just wanted to make sure we were doing a bit more to make sure we were prepared.
Right. Shall we move on then to the issues around the fairness in the food supply chain? And
sorry, can we just...
Sorry.
Do you want to go, Joe?
Okay.
I have a certain nervousness.
Right, okay. Go for it. I mean, look, but just bear in mind we are under a bit of pressure.
Yeah, I'm not being... It's just a couple of people, and we've heard about the impact of, it could run into tens of billions. Are we absolutely doing everything we can to make sure we're prepared for this? Was my instant reaction.
So foot and mouth is a particular threat because it's very easily transmissible on a lot of different vectors. You know, it can blow on the wind, it can come in on your shoes, it can come in on tyres and so on. So we take it extremely seriously. And I think the experiences that were had, twice in the 2000s with foot and mouth are sort of seared into the DEFRA effort. So we are doing everything we can to be as prepared as we can. What we find with all of these diseases, blue tongue, avian influenza, and so on, is that there's loads more we'd like to do, but we do as much as we can with the resources we've got. So we've stepped up our preparedness on foot and mouth in the light of what we've seen. Actually, we've done a risk assessment. Our chief vet is leading work. So yes, we're doing what we can.
I think to be clear as well, and I know Jane will jump in on this as well, it's the checks at the borders that we've had a lot of representation forward from, and we've heard about the lack of coverage and the lack of checks. I think that's where the point of that concern stems from.
Yeah, we've been to see, and the illegal meat smuggling that is coming does seem to be on quite a large scale, and it seems to overwhelm the resources that are there to stop it. So could you comment on that, on what, because it does seem to be quite a large gap?
Yes, I think you were in Dover last week, were you, visiting there? And I think my colleague accompanied you, Gareth Bainham Hughes. So you'll know that we give some money to the border force to do checks at the border proactively on some of that illegal smuggling, and also obviously we fund and support the work at Sevington, which is for the legal imported trade. So
different though, isn't it?
They are different, and we do think that the work to check the smuggling side is incredibly important.
The funds put in, say, the Port Health Authority, I think just to check 20% of the time. I think the border force were feeling, because they have so many other checks to do as well, and they're not experts in that they felt slightly, well, I won't put words in their mouth, but it looked like it was being slightly overwhelmed. So would you reconsider the resource maybe placed at the border? It's
all subject to the spending review. Yeah.
We've had quite protracted correspondence around the iPaths software scheme, around the question of it being updated. Are you able to confirm for the committee today that it wasn't actually updated until the 16th of January in relation to Germany and the food and mouth outbreak?
I'd have to write to you on that.
You're going to write
us
again?
It's not my responsibility, it's another Director General.
In which case, Jenny, you wanted to ask about TB?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So one more quick question and then we'll move on to profitability in the supply chain. We've spent over £1 billion over the last 10 years on controls compensation for TB, and I understand that the projections for the next decade are equally £1 billion for, as I said, controls compensation and checks. I know that you're reviewing the strategy at the moment, but what measures are being considered in that current strategy for how we can review, control and manage TB? And is there an expectation this budget will come down, or will it be maintained over the next decade?
Well, those budgetary decisions will be part of, again, following the spending review, but obviously we will do everything that's necessary to maintain confidence and tackle what is a really, really distressing disease for so many farmers. What we have done is what I did very early on was ask the department to look again at the whole system because we are concerned about its effectiveness. Yeah. And as a consequence, we've asked Professor Charles Godfrey to come back and update the work that he did back in 2018, and we're moving far more to badger vaccination, which we think can play a significant role, but it's a very big, complicated subject, so I wouldn't want to gloss over too quickly in just a few moments.
Understood. Thank you. Because you don't have much time.
Can we move on then to the fairness in the food supply chain? And I am mindful of the fact that time is marching on, and I am determined that fishing will get its hearing.
Yes, that was good.
So it's probably a reflection of my poor chairing, but it's also a reflection of just how much there is to talk about in the space at the moment. So, Jenny, can you lead us in the questioning and the fairness and the food supply chain?
There's a few, thank you, Chair. There's a few sections now that will go on to the profitability and the groceries code adjudicator and other issues that specifically sit within the supply chain. I'm not going to spend too long on mine because I appreciate the time that the Chair set out. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and many in this committee are very passionate about. We've talked about, we've skirted around a bit of this debate earlier on in our conversation around the key challenges facing the farming sector is profitability, and we can't have a viable functioning sector without really addressing those kind of root concerns. Now, DEFRA has argued equally that over the last few months, and making the case that the supply chain needs to be fairer. Can you talk us about some of the proposed changes to tax and subsidies that you're looking at to come on board to really tackle this issue as a department?
To tax and subsidies?
So where the department's thinking is on subsidies and shifting towards a more profitable sector, and a broad outline of what you're considering to increase profitability for the farming sector.
I'm not sure I quite follow the question, but I mean, basically, obviously, it's a market-driven system.
Yeah.
So it depends essentially on the relationships within the sector, and that is why I'm over a long period of time. I'm perfectly happy to pay tribute to the Chair and his predecessors for intervening in this a decade ago, introducing the Grocery Code Adjudicator and GSCOP and so on. But I think there's been a clear sense over time that more needed to be done, and as a consequence of the Agriculture Act, we now have the ability to introduce these fair dealing regulations, and we're taking that a sector-by-sector approach. And I'm very hopeful this will actually improve the relationships through the supply chain, because without that, you're absolutely right to say that our aspiration to get the agricultural sector into a strong position as a business sector will depend upon the ability to get a fair price for the product. Yeah, excellent. So you announced that the fruit and vegetable aid scheme for producers will end in England on the 1st of January 2026. What engagement are you having with the industry and devolved administrations to design an alternative to that? Because that is one of the legacy European Union schemes, and we're currently looking at what we would do to replace that. So we're in dialogue and conversation with people on that, but it was a legacy scheme that came to an end.
Great. And appreciate that in Scotland, Northern Ireland, they have similar schemes have been extended by the devolved administrations. Why have you taken a different approach there, and what are the potential implications of this?
Well, we want to look closely to make sure that it provides good value for money. Obviously, decisions that devolved governments make are their decisions. We don't always take the same decisions. Great.
I'll be passing on in a second, but before I do, we're going to cover off now the Groceries Code Adjudicator in some more detail. Course, yeah. Can I just flag up that and at the heart of this is the supermarkets and the profitability, the profits they make at the expense of the farmers, farming industry, and producers. Can I get you to comment, Minister? So over of the big 6 supermarkets, we saw Tesco make a profit of 2.8 billion, Sainsbury's making a profit of 700 million, Morrison's 835, Asda 1 billion, Lidl 43 million, and Aldi 536 million. Now, of those big 6, neither Morrison's nor Asda paid a penny in corporation tax over the previous year. Can that be seen as fair or right? And what can we'll go into some more detailed questioning on this, but really that sits, for me and for many farmers in my constituency, that sits at the epicentre of the challenges facing the farmers and producers that struggle to make a profit.
Well, and I suspect I'm going to answer this in a similar way on a number of these questions. Some of these issues fall far more within the Department of Business and Trade remit, and that's where the GCA actually is accountable to. But my understanding is the Competition and Markets Authority did do an investigation into supermarket practices, and they are very, very big businesses. They do make profits, but that's what you would probably expect from some of our major businesses in the country. And the issue for me is to make sure that we get a good, fair deal for farmers and that is why we're looking at these changes to help achieve that.
I'll be cheeky, and quickly before I pass on, I appreciate all of that, but in the context of farm washing, so I appreciate what you're saying about where those excessive profits, but in the context of farm washing, where some of those supermarkets that I've just named will pretend and reframe some of the goods on their shelves as coming from family farms, when they're actually in fact coming from mega farms, sometimes imported, and incredibly misleading to consumers. And I appreciate there's a consultation now that was started under out for review, that was started under the last government and has closed, and we're waiting for the results of that consultation to come back. But I really would urge the Minister that these do sit at the epicentre of some of the challenges facing farming, and we have to tackle profitability, but we also have to tackle fairness and what the consumer sees as fair and right. And it's actively misleading consumers when supermarkets, trusted supermarkets, are actively implying that something comes from a family farm when it's not. And I think that for me and for many of my constituents, that's a real issue that we would urge you to make sure that we address in the context of profitability as well.
Well, I understand the point you're making. What I would just gently say there is there is a fairly clear legal system around labelling, and labelling should not be inaccurate. So where it's inaccurate, then there is a legal issue. But we are, as you rightly say, looking very closely at the whole issue of labelling, and we'll try and make sure it is as accurate. Well, it should be accurate. It should always be accurate.
Yeah, thank you.
We're coming on to Josh and to lead some questioning on the Groceries Code adjudicator. Can I just be clear, though, on what your starting position is here? Do you think that supermarkets and suppliers are treating farmers fairly?
I think there is unhappiness clearly within the agricultural sector about the way they are sometimes treated, but I wouldn't want to characterise the food system as being anything other than actually overall successful, because we do have a successful food system in this country. Try and choose my words carefully here, because I think sometimes very successful businesses are unfairly castigated, but quite clearly there is a market power issue, and that I hear
You're not concerned that market power is being abused?
I think whenever you've got a situation where there is a strong level of power, there's always the possibility that is hard for others who are price takers, essentially.
You understand why this matters?
Absolutely, I understand why it matters, and it goes to the heart of my and the Secretary of State's vision for the future, that farms are successful businesses. But I also would not want to unfairly criticise other parts of the food chain, whether it be the food manufacturers or the retailers, who in my view do a good job in keeping the country supplied with affordable food. But exactly as has been described, there are power imbalances, and that is why we are addressing them, and that's why there's a case for government intervention, because there is that power imbalance.
And it's this tension between domestic production and cheap food?
Not necessarily, because we have very efficient producers in our country.
Right. Hey, Josh, you're going to pick up on the GC.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, in terms of the Grocery Code adjudicator, obviously it exists to uphold standards in the supply chain and to tackle bad practices like changing supply agreements retrospectively, late payments, stopping or significantly cutting the volume of goods being sold without a genuine commercial reason and reasonable notice. So it's a really important body. But what has your department done to look at whether the adjudicator's got enough resource to be able to proactively enforce the Grocery Supply Code of Practice?
Well, two things. One, as I say, it is actually directly a DBT responsibility. But my understanding is there is a current review underway, the fourth statutory review, which began on the 20th of March 2025. So I'm told that ministers in the DBT are still finalising the exact arrangements for the review, but it's in line with the Grocery Code Adjudicator Act. So I can't really tell you any more about that, but what DBT tell me is that we'll provide an opportunity for stakeholders to share their feedback, and that this committee's interim report and the published evidence will also inform that process.
And may I add something as well? As I understand it, the GCA, the adjudicator himself is able to set his fees and hasn't complained of a shortage of resource and can raise those fees on the retailers.
Okay, that's useful for us to know, maybe something for us to pick up. But we've heard from some farmers, and this was featured in a Country File episode on Sunday, that they're afraid to complain about breaches in the code for fear of being delisted and therefore losing their income. And that's despite the fact that the adjudicator can guarantee anonymity. And I'm sure you'd agree that's very concerning. We want people to be raising these bad practices where they exist. Because of that, there's been calls from the sector for the adjudicator's functions to be broadened out so it can proactively monitor the sector and investigate potential breaches of compliance without the need for specific complaints to be raised. Do you see any merit in doing that? Would you be supportive of changes that enable a more proactive adjudicator?
Well, I think, again, this will come through the review that's been carried out, but I think the case that has been made in the past against widening it is because its effectiveness has been that it is concentrated on those relatively few relationships directly with the retailers. And on the point raised about anxiety about raising complaints, I absolutely understand that. But my understanding is that both the grocery code adjudicator and I certainly know that the agricultural supply chain adjudicator have both introduced processes whereby people can speak to them confidentially.
But I think often farmers feel that they are still identifiable, and so the call from the sector is a more proactive adjudicator would enable these things to be looked into in the round without them needing to effectively stick their neck out and risk their income. So I hope that's something that the government are going to look at.
Well, we'll probably come on to the individual sector arrangements that are being made, but I think it's at that level that we can have closer dialogue.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Another point of the debate in the sector is the scope of the adjudicator, because currently it only covers the big players with turnovers of £1 billion or more. And there are lots of views on this, but evidence that we and previous committees have had clearly suggests that there's merit in the government lowering the threshold to bring more groceries businesses into the code of practice. The NFU, for example, has suggested that it be halved of the current level, so £500 million. Whilst it comes under the DBT, as you said, it clearly does affect the remit of your department for the most part. Now, I've laid down several written questions about lowering the threshold, and all I've had back from the DBT is that it's a matter for the Competitions and Markets Authority. But clearly, the CMA isn't going to take the decision to lower the threshold itself. Decisions of that magnitude are a matter for ministers. So can I ask you, Minister, whether you would be supportive of lowering the threshold?
I'm afraid I'm going to give you the same answer that you got from the DBT, which is a matter for the Competitions and Markets Authority. And for the reason I've explained earlier, we think the Grocery Code Adjudicator is working well.
Can I add?
Do you think it's working well?
I think it's working effectively, yes.
Can I just add, in terms of the coverage, as I understand it, with the £1 billion threshold that it's got, that the 10 largest retailers cover 97% of groceries sold in the UK, so its remit is very large. I think there's a different question then about scope. Do you do retailers or other parts of the supply chain as well, which we think is addressed by the agriculture supply chain adjudicator. But the question of scope for the retailers themselves, basically the biggest ones are already in, and they're most of the sales of the UK.
Well, that's what I wanted to come into really with my final question, because as you said, whilst the code covers most retailers, there are several individual players who've also got a direct relationship with farmers, aside from retailers, but are outside the remit of the adjudicator currently, in particular the food service and manufacturing sector. By most measures, as you said, the adjudicator's done a good job in increasing compliance, but because of its remit, we're only looking at retailers, and that is only a section of the part of the sector that the farmers are dealing with, and the concern is that there's bad practice elsewhere that's not being tackled because of the remit. So would you support an extension of the scope of the code to include, for example, wholesalers and food manufacturing businesses?
Again, I would say I think this can be raised as part of the current review that's going on. Alongside that, we've got the new regulations that are coming in that we're dealing with the agricultural supply code adjudicator, but I hear the point about the wider issues, and I'm certainly happy to look at that if evidence comes from your committee to show there's a problem.
Thank you, I appreciate that, because I think a lot of us feel when we're trying to raise this that it's very much affects DEFRA and DEFRA's functions, but it sits with the DBT, as you said. The DBT keeps saying it's a matter for the CMA, but as I said, I don't think the CMA are going to be making major decisions around a potential, widening of the code, which is something that the sector really seems to be clamouring for. So anything you can do to contribute to that and help us contribute to that would be much appreciated.
Can I just take you back to your assertion that you think the GCA is working well? The last 12 years, 13 arbitrations where the GCA has settled an issue between a supermarket and a supplier. The GCA on the Country File programme yesterday, the Country Code Adjudicator himself, was asked about an incident where his predecessor had told an applicant, if you start an adjudication process, it will have implications on your business. He was then asked another question, and answering the question about who, if you're a supplier, is there to protect you, the answer was given, nobody. Is that a system that's working well?
When I say the system is working well, what I mean is in terms of the way it has been set up and what it's been asked to do.
How many people work for the GCA office?
Not many in my experience. I don't know the exact number. I'd have
about
to go
7?
and find out. Yeah, exactly. But if the Grocery Code Adjudicator comes and says, as part of this review, that more resources needed, then clearly that will be listened to. But when I say
natural curiosity not maybe make you want to ask some of these questions without a review.
I think that's the purpose of having a review, that you look at it.
I mean, the problem here is, Minister, that if you don't think there's a problem, then I can't see much energy being put into finding a solution.
Well, what we're doing is putting a huge amount of energy into introducing the fair dealing regulations that we have the capability of doing, and I think it's really important that we concentrate our energy on that, because that's seems to me a very productive way forward and what we've been asked to do. So there's no complacency here. I absolutely understand the problem within the overall system, but there are a number of different ways of addressing that, and when I say I think the Grocery Code Adjudicator is working well, I think within what he's been asked to do, he's doing his job effectively.
Because farmers are seeing their basic payments turned off early. They see closure of schemes like the SFI leaving them with a cash flow crisis. The government tells them, we want to make your business more profitable in order to make up for that. But I'm not seeing any sense of urgency in terms of regulating the market to make that possible. How long do farmers have to wait before they see this change?
Well, there absolutely is a sense of urgency, because that is what we are doing and getting on with. And only in the last few weeks, some of the secondary legislation has been laid, and it will go on being laid as we work with the sector. But what I would say is it's very important that we get these things right, because they are very important to securing our food security and making sure the food system continues to operate effectively.
Okay. The other angle of this... Oh, sorry, Josh, you wanted to come back. My apologies.
Yeah, before we moved on, I just wanted to say that I think what we're hearing from a lot of farmers is they feel like it's a real David and Goliath situation with the supermarkets, right? And they don't feel that they have enough backing on their side to give them the voice to stand up to bad practices, essentially. And I think that is a massive part of the concerns around fairness in the supply chain today. And I would like to hear us being more proactive about that and doing more, because I think that would go a long way to restoring a lot of confidence in the sector, that we do understand the concerns, we do believe that more needs to be done, really, and I would like that to be looked at more if possible.
Before you pick up that point, 30 seconds from Sarah.
Yeah, very quickly. Farmers often receive a very small portion of the retail price of their produce. Some reports suggest that they get only about 1% of that, of the profit. Processors, transport companies and retailers take the majority. Is that fair?
Well, I think that goes to the heart of the whole discussion we're having, and it goes right back to the beginning about how we allocate the resources that are available. Some come from the taxpayer, quite a lot comes through the food system, but making sure that we've got proper fairness. I actually think the key to a lot of this is transparency and not getting the kind of surprises from purchasers that were described earlier, and that is why we're putting in place the fair dealing regulations, because it's a very complicated set of issues, which is why there isn't one blanket answer, because when you look at each different sector, they are genuinely different, and that is why it's appropriate, in my view, to do it sector by sector. And only time will tell whether this works, but obviously we've had it in the dairy sector already, moving on to the pig sector, and we will see over time. We will assess it, and if more action is needed, then we'll take more action. But I wouldn't want people going away from, or people watching this, to think that we're somehow describing a system which isn't overall effective. It is a very effective food system overall, but we do need to make sure there is fairness all the way through it, and that the primary producers absolutely get their fair reward. And I quite hear and understand why people feel that isn't always the case, and that's what we're seeking to address.
Okay, the other element of this is the agricultural supply chain adjudicator. Charlie, you're going to...
Yeah, I'll keep this very brief, so we've got plenty of time on fisheries. I mean, the failure of the GCA was in a sense that it didn't really take into account the complexity of the supply chains. It almost assumed there are farmers and supermarkets, which of course we know is not the case. But we can't undo what is done. The agricultural supply chain adjudicator is obviously a welcome addition to trying to address fairness in the supply chain. What reassurances can you give us today that will be sufficiently resourced and it'll work very closely with the GCA to ensure that producers are protected now going forward throughout the supply chain?
First of all, I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman, because he did a lot of this work before he came into Parliament, and he and I used to discuss it. Look, it's relatively early days for the ASCA, and we will see what is needed. But at the moment, I'm confident that he's happy with the resources he has to do the job. But there's a long way to go on this. But
can I supplement that?
Sure.
Is that okay? So it comes out of my budget. So I've allocated a budget to him. At the moment, obviously, he's only covering the new dairy contracts. When the existing dairy contracts come into his scope, which is in July, that's a bigger remit. And then as we add the additional sectors, they will get to be bigger remits. So again, it's the work is sized right at the moment. We may need to allocate more resource in future.
Thank you. And just one very brief supplementary. Is it possible just to outline to the committee the progress each sector is making towards that at the moment, just so we're clear on the timelines?
I thought you might ask this, and I haven't got the exact details, but basically 7th of July, I think, is when the dairy additionals arrive. We're working on the pig SI has already been laid, is that right? We're doing a consultation on fresh produce. We finished the consultation on fresh produce, so we're just working that through. And in fact, that I think is where the overlap between the agricultural supply chain adjudicator and the grocery code adjudicator is most relevant, because fresh produce suppliers actually often go direct to supermarkets, and I think it's where the ASCA may be able to add some significant value. And the other thing I'd mention, obviously, is that we've done these sector-by-sector consultations. We've had some excellent feedback. So we've had things, often we've had 350, 800 people, organisations responding to the consultations, giving us very detailed views. And then we're tailoring the approach according to what they've said. So in the pig sector, for instance, there are particular issues about ending of contracts and spot supplying and so on, which we're trying to address. In dairy, it's been about transparent pricing and so on.
Many hours of my life on the pig one.
You know more about it than I do by the time of
Anyway, we'll move on.
Are you done, Charlie?
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, listen, Janet, Emily, thank you for your participation thus far. We're going to move on to our third panel, and we'll have a very swift changeover. I would invite Mike Dowell and Colin Faulkner to the table.